All right, so get this. You've given us a bunch of articles on Ireland and Palestine. Like, what's the connection? Journalists, academics, even Irish politicians are all talking about it.
Yeah, the thing is, the link between these two places goes way deeper than just politics, you know?
That's what I thought was so fascinating. Your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to figure out WHY Ireland is such a hardcore supporter of Palestine. Is it like a real genuine thing, shared history and all that? Or is there some political strategy going on behind the scenes?
It's probably a mix of things, but to get started, let's go back in time a bit. Both Ireland and Palestine were under British rule, right? And some of the same colonial players were involved in both places. You ever heard what the Irish called Arthur Balfour? Bloody Balfour.
Oh, well, wait, hold on. This is the same Balfour who basically set the stage for Israel with the Balfour Declaration, right?
Yeah.
The guy who promised Britain's support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine.
Exactly. But years before that whole declaration thing, he was a bigwig in Ireland. And let's just say the Irish weren't exactly throwing him any parties. That nickname kind of says it all about how they felt about his policies during their fight for independence.
Man, talk about historical irony. That really shows how differently those two events might be seen through an Irish lens, don't you think? And it wasn't just Balfour, was it? The Black and Tans, that brutal British police force, were in both Ireland and Palestine.
Exactly. They were sent in to squash uprisings in both places. And their tactics, well, they were known for being super violent, often targeting regular people. Imagine what it must have been like to go through that kind of oppression on both sides.
It's kind of scary to think about. I can see why going through that together, that brutality under British rule, would create such a strong bond between the Irish and Palestinians, especially with the Palestinians still fighting for their own statehood today.
Definitely. Ireland's whole identity is tied to their history as a colony. It makes them really understand and connect with people who are going through similar struggles. In fact, polls show that over 70% of the Irish people just don't agree with how Israel is handling things with Palestine. That's not just a small group, it's a huge part of Irish society.
So when they see what's happening with the Israeli settlements in Gaza, does it, bring back memories of the British plantations in Ulster?
I think that's a very likely connection they're making. For many Irish people, seeing land being taken and people being forced out probably feels like watching a replay of their own painful past.
And then there's the Troubles, that long and awful conflict in Ireland itself.
Right, that experience gives them a whole other level of understanding when it comes to trying to make peace in a situation that feels impossible.
It must make their perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict so much more, informed by what they've been through themselves.
It's a living memory for a lot of people, and it shows that even in the darkest times, finding peace is possible. But it takes a huge effort and a willingness to compromise.
But then there's this whole other layer to the relationship, right? Ireland was officially neutral in World War II.
Neutrality is never as simple as it sounds. In Ireland's case, yeah, they were officially neutral, but there was some, let's call it discreet, cooperation with the Allies. Did you know they were the ones who provided the crucial weather reports for D-Day? You know, the landings?
Wow, that's a big deal.
It really shows how neutrality can be a lot more complex than just staying completely out of a fight.
But then there's also the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Their actions during World War II were, well, let's just say complicated.
Right. They worked with Nazi Germany, figuring the enemy of their enemy was their friend. And then to make things even more complicated, the Irish government officially sent condolences to Germany after Hitler died.
We should be clear here. We're just presenting the facts from the articles you gave us, right? We're not trying to take sides. It's obviously a sensitive topic.
Exactly. And it's those little details that make this whole deep dive so interesting. It's not a simple story, There's layers of history, ideology, and politics all tangled up together.
It's like Ireland's relationship with neutrality is a mini version of the whole situation. But let's switch gears and talk about the political situation now. It's clear that a lot of Irish people are passionate about supporting Palestine. But there's got to be some political stuff going on too, right?
Oh, definitely. One really interesting example is Sinn Féin, a party with strong ties to the IRA. And they're pushing for even stronger action against Israel.
That's pretty bold. And then there's the fact that Ireland officially recognizes a Palestinian state. That must have caused some problems, considering the pushback from Israel and the potential for economic fallout from the U.S. They're a big supporter of Israel, right?
The Irish leader even said that recognizing Palestine was simply the right thing to do. That's a pretty strong statement when you think about the potential consequences.
Makes you wonder how much influence public opinion has on this issue in Ireland.
It seems to be a major factor. It makes the whole relationship even more interesting, especially when you consider that some critics say this whole pro-Palestine stance is actually rooted in anti-Semitism within the Catholic Church. It's a complicated and sensitive accusation, and Ireland completely denies it.
There's definitely a lot more to unpack here, but before we do that, we need to talk about the elephant in the room, Ireland's economic reliance on the U.S.
Now that's where things get really interesting. The sources you gave us directly address this tension between Ireland's feelings for Palestine and their economic ties to the U.S. And as we know, the U.S. has a very different view on the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Exactly. So could this economic dependence be holding Ireland back from fully supporting Palestine?
Let's jump right back into this whole push and pull between Ireland's support for Palestine and their reliance on the U.S. economy, right?
It's like they're trying to walk a tightrope. On the one hand, we've seen this outpouring of support for Palestine from the Irish people, but then there's this strong economic partnership with the U.S., which, as we know, has a very different stance on the conflict.
It's a tough balance for any country to strike. Ireland's been incredibly successful at attracting foreign investment, especially from those big U.S. companies, and that's been huge for their economy. But it does raise the question, is that economic dependence influencing their actions on the world stage?
Because the U.S. is such a strong ally of Israel, right? Tons of financial aid, military support. It feels like there's this unspoken pressure on Ireland not to make any waves.
Oh, absolutely. One of the articles you shared really highlighted how much power a small group of U.S. multinationals has in Ireland. They contribute a huge chunk of Ireland's corporate tax revenue. We're talking billions of dollars. It's easy to see why Ireland might be hesitant to do anything that could jeopardize that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Speaking of actions, or lack thereof, how did Ireland respond during the recent conflict in Gaza?
That's where things get even more, contradictory. Despite a lot of people in Ireland condemning Israel's actions in Gaza, the Irish government got hit with some pretty harsh criticism for not doing more to help Palestine.
Wasn't there something about a bill, the Occupied Territories Bill? It was supposed to ban trade with Israeli settlements?
Right, that was back in 2018, but it's been stuck in the Irish parliament ever since. Opposition parties accuse the government of basically bowing to pressure from the U.S. to kill the bill. A pretty clear example of how those economic interests could be swaying policy decisions.
That's a pretty serious accusation. And what about those reports of Ireland letting U.S. military planes use their airspace and airports? We know those flights could be carrying weapons headed for Israel.
That's definitely a significant form of indirect support. And let's not forget, there were also reports that Ireland's central bank was still selling Israeli bonds, basically helping to fund the very military actions that so many Irish people are against.
It's starting to feel like a bit of a disconnect, you know? All these cultural expressions of solidarity, calls for a Palestinian state, but then there's this other side, this economic reality, pulling Ireland in a different direction.
It's the tough reality of international relations. Ireland's trying to juggle their support for Palestine with their reliance on a global superpower that has the opposite view.
One of the articles even used the term hidden tax to describe the compromises Ireland might be making on their principles in exchange for that U.S. investment.
It makes you think, doesn't it? What's the real cost of economic dependence? Is Ireland sacrificing their moral voice for financial gain? It's a tough question.
Yeah, it's a question every listener will have to grapple with on their own. But it's obvious that this relationship with the U.S. is shaping Ireland's actions, even if it's happening behind closed doors.
And it's not just those big political moves either. It plays out in everyday trade and military cooperation. One report even found that Ireland increased their exports of dual-use technology to Israel during the Gaza conflict, technology that could be used for military purposes.
That's pretty jarring to hear, especially when we think about Irish politicians calling for a ceasefire and humanitarian aid at the same time.
Yeah, it reminds us that actions speak louder than words. It highlights the gap that can exist between the ideals of solidarity and the practical realities of global politics.
So Ireland might be a vocal supporter of Palestine on the surface, but it seems like their economic ties to the U.S. could be holding them back from really putting their weight behind those words.
It raises some tough questions about the limits of solidarity when those powerful economic interests are involved.
It's a sobering thought. And it makes you wonder, Does this tension play out in other countries, too? How often are nations forced to compromise their values because of economic pressure?
It's a key takeaway from this deep dive, for sure. Understanding these complex connections between history, economics, and global relations, it's crucial for navigating the world today.
Okay, so we've looked at the historical parallels, the whole neutrality thing, and this push and pull between solidarity and economic pragmatism. But there's another piece to this puzzle, isn't there? The role of Irish culture.
Exactly. It's a vibrant and dynamic aspect of this relationship. It goes beyond just political statements and gets into the world of music, art, and even sports.
We've been going through all the historical and political connections between Ireland and Palestine, and it's been pretty complex so far. But now we get to explore something a little bit more hopeful, maybe. Like, what's the role of Irish culture in all of this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thread that runs through everything we've been discussing. It shows how deeply this connection runs in Irish society. It goes way beyond just politics and diplomacy. It's about a shared sense of humanity, a real desire for justice. And those feelings are expressed through music, art, you name it, even sports.
So it's not just politicians and diplomats who are, like, engaged with this issue.
Not at all. And what's amazing is the variety of voices and how they're getting involved. You have these big name authors like Sally Rooney, Anna Burns. They've used their fame to put a spotlight on Palestinian stories by signing open letters, participating in boycotts, that kind of thing.
That's using their platform for something good, reaching a whole new audience.
Right. And then there are musicians like this hip hop group, Kneecap. They've got this raw energy, and their lyrics are really pro-Palestine. They're tackling the conflict head on in their music, making people confront some uncomfortable truths.
It kind of reminds me of how punk rock used to be, super political and in your face.
Yeah, their music really speaks to young people. They mix traditional Irish rebel music with a modern sound. It's this powerful combination of cultural pride and activism.
Sounds like a pretty effective mix, and it's not just in English, right? Like I read about some artists using the Irish language too.
Yeah, you've got the Shan Vans, this indie band. They actually sing about Palestinian prisoners in Irish Gaelic. It's a great example of how music can connect people across different places and languages. It's about sharing a common human experience.
Music really is a universal language.
Yeah.
And this whole cultural solidarity thing, it goes beyond just established artists and musicians, right?
Absolutely. The International Wall in Belfast is a perfect example. It's a space that's traditionally been about global human rights, and now local artists have turned it into this amazing visual tribute to the Palestinian struggle.
I've seen pictures of those murals. They're incredible.
Yeah.
So powerful.
Yeah, it's visual storytelling, right? It challenges the stories you usually hear in the mainstream media, and it's right there for everyone to see.
Speaking of public displays of solidarity, what about that whole thing with the Irish women's basketball team? They refused to shake hands with their Israeli opponents.
Yeah, that definitely got people talking. It brought up that whole question of whether athletes should use their platform to make political statements, and it really highlighted the tensions around the conflict.
Makes you think. Solidarity can take so many different forms, from symbolic gestures to actual actions that directly benefit the Palestinian people. It's inspiring, really. It speaks to the creativity and commitment of the Irish people.
It really does. Ireland's approach is so multifaceted. It's political, it's cultural, it's grassroots activism. It's incredible to see how people can come together and demand change, and how culture can be this powerful tool for social justice.
So after all this incredible deep dive, where do we end up? Ireland's relationship with Palestine is definitely complicated. There's the historical parallels, the political maneuvering, even economic factors to consider. But through it all, there's this constant, powerful feeling of solidarity.
It's really quite remarkable, this empathy for the Palestinian cause. It cuts across all these lines, political lines, and it expresses itself in some pretty unexpected ways.
It's a reminder that human empathy is a powerful force, and that even when things seem impossible, the hope for a just and peaceful solution can, it can survive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And here's one final thought for you all to consider. Could Ireland, with their unique perspective, their experience with the Good Friday Agreement, and their history of dealing with these really complicated political and cultural situations, could they offer some insights into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, maybe even some pathways towards progress? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.